folks, welcome back to the Frontier Western Heritage Channel. I'm Todd Kestner here in Bozeman, Montana, and today I want to take a look at a couple of very popular firearms from the Old West period, and actually the same model, just different eras. I picked up a 1849 pocket a few months ago, original, and wanted to compare that to the third generation Colt that I had purchased previously. So as many of you know, this 1849 pocket Colt was the most popular Colt during the percussion era, with over 225,000 produced. And as I travel around, like I said in other videos, I just stop by places that have a potential for having antique firearms, and sure enough, stopped by a place and this was on the shelf. It appeared to be in really good condition and caught my eye. It seemed functional, and so picked up this, and then thought I'd like to, just for my own curiosity, compare that to this third generation 1849 pocket Colt, and to see how close the two are together when it comes to the reproduction versus the original. Well folks, I am going to try to compare these two through the viewfinder here, so this may be a little clumsy, but let's see what we can do here. So I'm going to start with the original 49 pocket, and I don't think I said in the intro, but this gun, I checked the serial numbers. The tag in the store said 1853, and the Colt 1851 Navy, and what we call now the 51 Navy, and the Colt 1849 pocket came out in 1850. So they both came out about the same year. They've been differentiated because one's a pocket model and one's a belt model, but they both came out in about 1850 and both sold very well. The 49 pocket is really a scaled down version of the 1851 Navy and has a lot of the same attributes to it, and the balance and all of that is something that I really appreciate. So I'm going to just take these two apart superficially at least, and let's take a look at the two of them. Now the one thing about the original, I'm going to reach my screwdriver here. One thing about the original is that the barrel wedge just slides right out, almost too easy. So I'm not particularly thinking that should be that loose. And this one in the third generation is much, see if I can get that off. There we go. Is much tighter. So I'm going to pull these cylinders off, take a look at the third generation versus the first generation. So the third generation, a lot of folks have said, you know, those are just dressed up U-birdies, and I guess that's basically true. They're mostly U-birdie parts, not quite under the watchful eye by Colt as much as the second generation reproductions. But I'll tell you what, I have found the third generation absolutely beautiful. There's nothing wrong with the third generation Colts as far as craftsmanship and appearance and functionality. I have found this to be as good as anything. And one of the things that I did notice on the third generation, even with the U-birdie parts, I'm going to point this barrel at the camera, hopefully you can pick that up. There is a very deep cut rifling. It almost makes the end of the barrel look like a stop sign. You don't see that in the other reproductions, just the plain old U-birdies or Piettas or anything. Normally, the rifling is not quite that deep. So they did manufacture these a little bit different than they did just their regular reproduction. So there's something to that third generation Colt that makes it more authentic than just your average everyday U-birdie, besides just the finish. But it's not quite as Colty as the second generation. But let's take a look at this third generation and this original, and just want to compare cylinder sizes. Darn near identical. Let's see if I can get them lined up. It's really be hard to tell if one is larger than the other, so I'm going to tell you that they're the same. And if you look down at the end of the chambers here, really the chambers on the one from 1853, this original, look pretty darn good. They're not wore out. I think this is a gun that spent a lot of its time in a drawer, maybe carried but not fired that much. So when it comes to the cylinder, and you can see the stagecoach scene, I don't know if you can pick that up on the camera or not. but the stagecoach robbery scene that's on the 49 pocket, it is barely visible. You can see if just a couple, I can't get this thing to focus. You can see just a little bit of the wheels on the stagecoach, and so that original engraving, roll engraving on the cylinder is nearly intact, and at least somewhat visible. So if I take let's take this loading lever and plunger, take a look at these two barrels. Let me center them here a little bit and get the other stuff out of the way. Pretty close. I mean, pretty darn good. The third generation has just a slightly thicker latch for the loading lever, but really not, and I'm not looking through my viewfinder very good for you guys. Here we go. Just a slightly larger latch for the loading lever. This is the skinny loading lever latch. This one probably would be considered that too compared to others, but other reproductions. But really about the only difference that I can see is that just slightly different loading lever latch. So it's looking pretty good. Now the third generation here has a countersunk screw that makes that joint right there for the plunger, and this one, the original, has a screw that is not countersunk. It's actually, the head of it is completely resting on the steel. So it's not exactly the same from one to the other, but pretty darn close. One thing I did notice right off, and let me see if I can get that in focus at all. This is going to be challenging. I haven't done one of these trying to do this in front of the viewfinder. But both of them have the 2-line address on them. And I'm going to get this closer to my face so I can read it to you. So the one made in 1853 says address Sam Colt, and it's Samuel with the apostrophe L to shorten it, New York City. And my third generation, get that in better light for me, I can read it better. Address Samuel Colt, New York City, and it's got a design on either end of the writing. So they've done a good job of reproducing it, at least the way it was written. But one thing you notice right off is the original from 1853. I can read the writing right now because it is the right side up, and if I look at my third generation, the writing is upside down. So they stamped the barrel opposite from the original to the third generation. So they're not stamped exactly the same. The lettering and the wording is exactly the same, but it's upside down on the third generation. So just a small difference there. Now, according to Flaterman's Book of Antique Firearms, there are, if you wanted to have a collection of every 49 pocket that was ever produced, you would have a collection of about 200 guns, because barrel length, and I mean this thing went, we're talking 1850 to 1872 that this was in production. So a lot of changes were made over the years, just slight variations over the years. And so maybe the switch over in the direction that the letters were engraved on the barrel is just one of those 200 variations. So that may not be really be a deal breaker when it comes to authenticity. It might depend on, and guys that know the 49 pocket at much greater detail than I do might be able to answer that question. Did they switch the engraving of the lettering, flip it one way or the other as these things progressed? Taking a look down the barrel, extremely similar there too. Let me get that plunger out of the way. And we've got a real small difference, if any difference, looking down that barrel. And I don't know if you can see it. Let me see if I can get my hand out from under the other side. There you go. This 1853 first generation's got a heck of a good barrel in it. It's one of the things that kind of got me excited when I picked it up, is that the barrel rifling was pretty sound. Let me grab a piece of paper, see if I can make that light up a little bit. And I'm hoping that this is focusing at least part of the time here, because I am looking at this little tiny viewfinder and it's hard for me to tell. Let's see if we can get this thing angled, get some light in there. It may be a little bit better, but there we go. You can see the rifling, just pretty good rifling. I mean, it's a little rough, but it's not, we're talking 1853. So I got a feeling this gun was, like I said earlier, look at that rifling. I'd say this thing was not fired as much as it was carried. And then the rifling, of course, in the 3rd generation, which is nearly brand new. It's been fired, but it's nearly brand new. So let's take a look at the 2 frames and grips. So in my 3rd generation, I'm looking at a case-hardened frame, case-hardened hammer, and then, of course, it's got Sam Colt's signature, because they call this one the Signature Series, down the grip, and silver plated where the brass trigger guard and backstrap are. And you can see the sight on the top of the hammer, and things are pretty clean, and you can see the case hardening on the steel. So, of course, steel wasn't the same as steel is today on this one from 1853, but I did find this interesting. The brass trigger guard and back strap still have a lot of the original silver on it. So you can see that's a brass trigger guard and that's a brass back strap, and they're silver. So again, this one is, they were silver plated. This one retains, most of it's silver, and yet the frame itself has aged to the point of what you'd expect since 1853, while the silver has remained pretty well intact on the gun. So it's kind of a neat thing that is still on there, just to let you know that, yeah, it was silver plated at one time, and pretty obvious with the amount of coverage that's still there. Sight looks about the same, hammer looks about the same. Silver plating looks good, and you can see the case hardened versus that may have been case hardened, it may have just been the steel at the time. Well, I have successfully taken down both the 3rd generation and 1st generation right down to the springs, and actually I'm kind of shocked on how easy it was to take down that 1st generation Colt. This is a little rough inside. I don't know if the camera can pick it up. I mean, there's some just minute surface rust that would just wipe off with a good cleaning, but overall this thing came apart. The screws weren't stuck, and really had no trouble taking this thing apart. So I was kind of pleased by that. I had not tried it before and didn't do it on camera because I would be trying to reach around the camera and do it and didn't know what it was going to take and might have to even give up. But it all came apart very, very easily. One thing that I had mentioned in the introduction when I first started comparing these guns that I forgot to get back to is that the tag in the store said this 1st generation 49 pocket was built in 1853, and I had absolutely no reason to doubt that. The guy at the store is a super person. I mean, he's not going to put something on there that would mislead anybody. But just for fun, I wanted to see how he determined that. So I went to the internet and put in the Colt serial number, and sure enough, 1853. So with this thing built in 1850, pardon me, the actual model coming out on the market in 1850, this is pretty early production in 1853. So it's kind of cool that I've got one that's that close to the first year of production. So as I'm looking at these parts, and I don't really need to go through them one by one exactly, but very similar, and I'm sure it's for ease of production, but the 3rd generation Colt, some of the screws are the same as far as head size and that sort of thing. I got to the 1st generation, had to change screwdriver heads a little more often because the screws are from one location to the next on the gun are different sizes, and so that's one thing that was different. The screws don't exactly match up. Again, when it comes to authenticity, to me that's not a deal breaker. It's something you wouldn't even realize unless you compared it to an original and had to change screwdriver heads. So all in all, they did a pretty good job internally and externally in making these things match. One thing I did notice, and let me pull the 3rd generation hammer up here. get it a little more centered for you. The pawl, or the arm that rotates the cylinder, is a little bit different on the third generation. That's the one here on the right, and I'm going to keep that screw close to where it goes back in on that grip. So the arm has got more of a curvature to it, and then the spring itself has got quite a curvature to it in the opposite direction, and that's what keeps that up against the cylinder as you're cocking the hammer and rotating that cylinder. When I take a look at the first generation, you'll see it's got a curvature to it, but it's just kind of stubby compared to what I've got here in the third generation. Also, the spring that holds the pawl close to the ratchets on the back of the cylinder, but keeps that thing going out through the frame and rotating that cylinder, that spring is gone. And I forgot to show you guys that when the gun was assembled, but I can cock it when it's pointed downhill, but I can't cock it when it's pointed up, and that would be because this thing would not be pressed to go through the frame. It's just basically gravity driven right now with that piece missing. And I knew that meant that spring was broken. I fully expected to be able to pull this out of the frame and have a busted spring fall out, and that's not what happened. It's just gone. So somebody had it apart. It's a little slot in there. I don't know if you can see that. This camera may not focus that close. Little slot in the back where that spring slides into. And it's completely gone. So the slot's empty, which makes it very easy to replace. You can actually still get parts, and a lot of them are reproduction parts for an original gun, but they're still made to fit the original gun. They're not the original parts, but they are manufactured originally as close as they can, and they function in these old antiques, and so you can find the parts to fix that. So I'm going to fix that and make this thing operate exactly how it should. Again, all in all, I'm not seeing a big difference, screw head difference. It goes together the same. Triggers very, very similar from one model to the other. There's a little bit of change in the actual bolt, the way the bolt is constructed. The bottom one here is the one from 1853, that generation 1, and the top is from the third generation. And again, I think that difference is probably a manufacturing, something that makes it a little easier to manufacture. It's an advantage to have a lot of these bolts the same from one pocket model to the other, and again, you'd never know it if you didn't take it apart and compare it to an original, but you can see there's a bit of difference between the original and the third generation. Pretty close comparison between the two guns, and so you're not really missing out on much if you don't have an original. You're shooting something that's very much like the original in the reproductions. So I'm going to put this thing back together, and we'll wrap up this video and go from there. Well, I got both the first generation 49 pocket from 1853 and the third generation 49 pocket back together. I marvel at the ease in which I was able to take apart a gun that was 170 years old, and the screws aren't stripped, the heads are good, everything is good. The spring on the back of the pawl needs to be replaced, but outside of that, looking pretty good. So got a gun that's in good shape inside and out, and very similar, I would say, to the third generation, that they did a really good job on making this as close to the original as possible. But it did answer another question, that is, can you order Colt parts for a third generation and put it in a first generation Colt? And the answer is no. There's too many differences. Even though they're extremely similar, they're not close enough where you can just swap parts. So if you've got an original, you're going to have to find an outlet for either reproduction parts for an original or original parts. And another thing I noticed too, if I take the cylinder from my 49 pocket that is the third generation, I could put it on there, and it almost seems like it's swappable. See if I could rotate it, if it locks up pretty well. But if I take my original cylinder from 1853 and try to put it on my 3rd generation Colt, it goes that far, and that's it. So again, just minor differences, but if I go on this way, it goes a lot farther. So it's really the back of the cylinder that's a little bit thicker. So all the farther it goes this direction, and if I flip it around, it goes quite a bit further. So the back of the cylinder is a little thicker than on this original version than on the 3rd generation Colt. So things aren't perfectly interchangeable, and so it's not something that's going to be easy to find parts for necessarily, but they're out there and you can find them. And it doesn't mean that this gun will never function, because I can find the spring to fix it. I just can't swap it out with the Uberti spring, or more than likely not with the spring from a 2nd generation also, which I don't have one available for me to compare. So overall, I'm pretty pleased with my 49 pocket model, this original Colt from 1853, and pleased that I could take it apart and get it back together, and things inside don't look too bad. I can replace that missing spring. I did notice too that the hammer tension is pretty severe, and so it's got a pretty tough hammer drawback, the amount of power it takes to draw that back. And a lot of that is because when it lands on the cap, you want the hammer to stay put and not just bounce backwards with recoil or gases coming out the back. But timing is great, lockup is good. So if I get that spring fixed so that I can move the cylinder each time that I cock it without wondering if it's going to happen or not, or having to point it down instead up, once I get that fixed, I've got a gun here that I kind of think I'm going to take to the range. And some of you are probably thinking, why in the world would you want to shoot something that's 170 years old? And I think, why in the world wouldn't you? I mean, it's in really good shape. I have not tried to get the nipples out of it, and that could be a challenge. And they are a little bit eroded on the inside, so that does concern me just a little bit. I'll probably load one chamber if I use these nipples and try it and see what happens. If there's a tremendous amount of blowback, I don't want to have a chain fire and with these older nipples. So I may have to soak those and get them out. Maybe not. I don't know. The rest of the gun came apart pretty easy, so it may not be that big of a deal. But possibly have to change out the nipples. But other than that, fix that spring. I've got a perfectly functional gun. Timing is great. Lockup is great. Hammer tension is great. And sight picture and everything on the front sight's not worn off. It's small, but it's not worn off. And overall, pretty pleased with being able to find an original Colt, 170-year-old Colt, that is in good enough shape that it functions mechanically, and not only that, is probably very likely a very good shooter, and be a lot of fun to find out. So that's a comparison between the 3rd generation Colt Pocket and the 1st generation Colt Pocket. Hope you enjoyed the video, and again, as always, I just want to thank you for coming. Check in with different so as many of you, and just easy to carry around. Dadgummit, what in the world is it? My 3rd generation, that's what I'm looking for. You know how to do it, just do it.